The darkness above the Eastern Front held secrets that would haunt the German Wehrmacht for years to come. In the bitter winter of 1942, as snow blanketed the frozen battlefields of Russia, a sound began to pierce the night that would send shivers down the spines of even the most hardened Nazi soldiers. It wasn't the roar of engines or the thunder of artillery. It was something far more unsettling. A whisper, a gentle whoosh, like fabric tearing through the night sky. German sentries would crane their necks upward, searching the star-filled darkness for the source of this eerie sound. Sometimes they caught glimpses, shadows darker than the night itself, moving with ghostly silence across the moon. Then came the explosions. Supply depots erupted in flames. Ammunition dumps vanished in thunderous blasts. Command posts crumbled to rubble. And by dawn, the shadows were gone, leaving only destruction and a growing sense of dread. The whispers began in the trenches first, soldier to soldier, bunker to bunker. NACHTHEXEN, they called them, night witches. The name spread like wildfire through German ranks, carrying with it a supernatural terror that rational military minds struggled to explain. How could these phantom attackers strike with such precision, then vanish without a trace? How could they evade the mighty Luftwaffe's fastest fighters and most sophisticated detection equipment? What the Germans didn't know was that their tormentors weren't supernatural beings at all. They were young women, many barely out of their teens, flying wooden biplanes held together with fabric and wire. They had no radios, no parachutes, no heating in their open cockpits. What they possessed was something far more dangerous. An unbreakable will to defend their motherland and the tactical brilliance to turn their apparent weaknesses into devastating advantages. These were the night witches of the 588th Night Bomber Regiment, and their story would become one of the most extraordinary chapters in the annals of aerial warfare. As German soldiers huddled in their bunkers, trading fearful stories of the ghostly attackers, they unknowingly spoke of heroes whose courage would echo through history long after the last bomb had fallen and the final shot had been fired. The fear was real. The whispers were spreading. And somewhere in the darkness above, the night witches were just getting started. The story of the night witches began not in the cockpit of a warplane, but in the mind of a visionary woman who refused to accept the limitations society placed on her gender. Marina Reskova, known throughout the Soviet Union as their Amelia Earhart, had already shattered barriers by becoming the first woman to pilot a long-distance flight across Russia. By 1941, as Hitler's war machine rolled across the Soviet border in Operation Barbarossa, Reskova saw an opportunity to revolutionize warfare itself. The German invasion caught the Soviet Union unprepared. In the opening weeks, entire air regiments were destroyed on the ground. Experienced pilots fell in devastating numbers. The Red Army was retreating on all fronts, and Stalin was growing desperate for any advantage that might stem the Nazi tide. It was in this moment of crisis that Marina Reskova made a proposal that would have seemed impossible just months earlier. She marched into the Kremlin and convinced Stalin himself to authorize the creation of 3 all-female air regiments. Not women serving as support personnel or nurses, actual combat pilots, navigators, and ground crew. The decision was met with skepticism from military commanders who doubted whether women could handle the physical and psychological demands of aerial combat. But Reskova had an answer for every objection. The Soviet Union was fighting for its very survival, and they could not afford to waste half their population's potential. The call went out across the vast expanse of the USSR, from Moscow's universities to Siberian villages. From factory floors to collective farms, young women answered. They came as teachers and students, seamstresses and engineers, pilots and mechanics. Some had never seen an airplane up close. Others had been flying crop dusters and mailplanes since childhood. What united them was a burning determination to drive the fascist invaders from their Homeland. Among those who volunteered was Nadezhda Popova, a 19-year-old music student whose delicate features masked nerves of steel. There was Yevgenia Jigolenko, barely 18, who had dreamed of flying since watching her first airshow as a child. Irina Sabrova would eventually become the most decorated woman in Soviet military history. These were not hardened warriors. They were daughters, sisters, students, and dreamers who chose to transform themselves into instruments of war. The selection process was brutal. Of the thousands who applied, only the most exceptional were chosen. They needed perfect eyesight, steady hands, quick reflexes, and the psychological fortitude to face death night after night. Physical strength was important, but mental resilience was everything. Many of the selected women had never experienced violence, never held a weapon, never imagined they would one day rain death from the skies. By late 1941, the chosen few were gathering at training bases across the Soviet Union. They came carrying suitcases filled with civilian clothes and hearts full of patriotic fervor. What they found waiting for them would test every assumption about warfare, gender, and what human beings could endure in defense of their homeland. The transformation from ordinary young women into the legendary night witches was about to begin, though none of them could have imagined the extraordinary journey that lay ahead. The aircraft assigned to the newly formed 588th Night Bomber Regiment was enough to make veteran pilots laugh or weep. The Polikarpov Po-2 was a relic from another era, a wooden biplane designed for training student pilots and crop dusting. With its maximum speed of just 94 miles per hour and an operational ceiling that barely cleared tall buildings, it seemed more suited to a museum than a battlefield. The women's first glimpse of their combat aircraft was a moment of profound disillusionment. The Po-2 South were constructed of plywood and canvas, held together with wire and hope. The cockpits were open to the elements, offering no protection from the brutal Russian winter that could freeze exposed skin in minutes. There were no radios for communication between aircraft, no parachutes for emergency escapes, no armor plating to protect against enemy fire. Even the bomb racks were improvised, cobbled together from whatever materials the mechanics could scrounge. Male pilots at the training base made no effort to hide their amusement. Here were these young women, many of them city-bred intellectuals, expecting to fly combat missions in what amounted to flying coffins. The jokes were cruel and constant. The enemy will die laughing when they see what's coming. Maybe you can defeat the Luftwaffe with your knitting needles. These planes are so slow. You'll be fighting World War I all over again. But beneath the ridicule, something remarkable was happening. The women began to see possibilities where others saw only problems. If their planes were too slow to outrun enemy fighters, they were also too slow to be effectively targeted by pilots trained to intercept modern aircraft. If they couldn't carry heavy bomb loads, they could make up for it with precision and frequency. If they had no radios, they would develop silent hand signals and formation flying techniques that defied conventional wisdom. The winter training was merciless. In temperatures that dropped to -40 degrees Fahrenheit, the women learned to maintain their aircraft with frozen fingers, to navigate by stars when compasses failed, and to land on improvised airstrips carved from snow and ice. They studied German tactical manuals, memorized the silhouettes of enemy aircraft, and practiced emergency procedures until they could execute them blindfolded. Most crucially, they mastered the art of flying in absolute silence. The Po-2's engine could be cut completely, allowing the aircraft to glide like a ghost through the night sky. This technique, born of necessity rather than design, would become their greatest tactical advantage. A gliding Po-2 made virtually no sound except for the whisper of wind through its rigging, a sound so subtle that German sentries often mistook it for a gentle breeze. By spring 1942, the transformation was complete. The laughing young women who had arrived with civilian luggage had become hardened aviators capable of coaxing impossible performance from their humble aircraft. They had learned to see their Po-2 South not as flying coffins, but as perfect weapons for a new kind of warfare. What the German Luftwaffe would soon discover was that in aerial combat, as in life, the most dangerous opponent is often the one you underestimate. The Night Witches were ready for war. Armed with straw planes and nerves of steel, June 1942 marked the beginning of a terror campaign that would haunt German forces for the remainder of the war. As darkness fell over the front lines near Rostov-on-Don, the first operational missions of the 588th Night Bomber Regiment commenced with all the chaos and confusion of untested warriors facing mortal combat. The young women climbed into their open cockpits with hands that trembled not from cold, though the night air bit through their inadequate flight suits, but from the electric anticipation of battle. Nadezhda Popova, her face barely visible beneath her leather helmet, exchanged a final glance with her navigator. Neither woman spoke. Words seemed inadequate for the moment. When ordinary citizens crossed the threshold into active warfare, the first missions were baptisms by fire. Anti-aircraft guns erupted from German positions like deadly fireworks, sending tracer rounds streaking across the night sky in brilliant, lethal patterns. The women discovered that their slow-moving aircraft, while difficult for fighters to intercept, were sitting ducks for ground-based flak. Po-2 South returned to base with fabric wings shredded by shell fragments and wooden fuselages, splintered by near misses. On her third mission, 20-year-old Yevgenia Zhigalenko experienced the reality of combat when her aircraft's engine seized over enemy territory. With no parachute and no radio to call for help, she faced a choice that would define her war: crash land behind enemy lines or attempt a dead-stick glide back to Soviet territory. She chose to fight, nursing her dying aircraft through 20 minutes of silent descent that ended in a bone-jarring landing just meters from friendly trenches. But with each sortie, the women refined their technique. They learned to cut their engines while still kilometers from their targets, gliding in complete silence through the darkness. The approach was poetry written in physics, a delicate balance of altitude, airspeed, and wind drift that required split-second timing and absolute trust between pilot and navigator. Too early, and they would fall short of their target. Too late, and the engine restart might fail, leaving them to crash in enemy territory. The psychological effect on German forces was immediate and profound. Soldiers reported hearing only the gentlest whisper of wind before explosions erupted around them. It was like being attacked by ghosts, wrote one Wehrmacht officer in his diary. You hear nothing, see nothing, and then your ammunition dump is in flames. How do you fight an enemy you cannot detect? The women flew multiple sorties each night, sometimes as many as 8 or 10 missions before dawn. They would land, hastily refuel and rearm their aircraft, grab a few minutes of rest, then launch again into the darkness. Sleep became a luxury measured in minutes rather than hours. Food was eaten cold and on the run. Letters from home went unread for days at a time. By autumn 1942, the 588th Regiment had flown over 3,000 combat sorties and dropped more than 23,000 bombs on German positions. Their accuracy rate was extraordinary, a testament to the skill they had developed flying their humble Po-2 South with scientific precision. German supply lines began to buckle under the constant nighttime harassment. Ammunition shortages plagued frontline units. Morale plummeted as soldiers spent sleepless nights waiting for the next whispered attack. The Night Witches had found their wings, and the darkness had become their domain. Each successful mission built their confidence and refined their tactics, transforming frightened young women into aerial predators who owned the night sky. The real battle with the Luftwaffe's finest was yet to come. The Luftwaffe's response to the Night Witch menace. reveal both the arrogance and the ultimate limitations of Nazi Germany's supposedly invincible war machine. Hermann Göring, commander-in-chief of the German Air Force, was personally outraged that a group of women flying wooden biplanes was terrorizing his troops and disrupting critical supply operations. The order came down from the highest levels: eliminate the NACHTHEXEN at any cost. The Germans deployed their most advanced aircraft against the 588th Regiment, Messerschmitt Bf 109s, the backbone of the Luftwaffe and among the fastest fighters in the world, were tasked with hunting down the night witches. These cutting-edge machines, capable of speeds exceeding 350 miles per hour, represented the pinnacle of German aviation technology. Their pilots were seasoned veterans who had dominated the skies over Poland, France, and the early Eastern Front campaigns. But the hunters quickly discovered they were chasing ghosts. The Po-2 South flew at altitudes so low that ground-based radar couldn't distinguish them from hills and trees. When German fighters attempted to intercept them, the speed differential created an almost impossible tactical challenge. A Messerschmitt diving at combat speed would overshoot a Po-2 in seconds. Unable to slow down enough to maintain a firing solution on the dramatically slower target, Hauptmann Johann Steinhoff, one of Germany's most decorated pilots, described the frustration in his combat reports. It is like trying to catch a butterfly with a racing car. By the time we locate them visually, we are past them. When we circle back, they have vanished into the darkness like smoke. The advanced navigation and targeting systems that made German fighters deadly against modern aircraft became useless against opponents who flew by instinct and starlight. The Luftwaffe tried different tactics. They stationed fighters at various altitudes, hoping to catch the night witches during their approach or departure. They used searchlights to illuminate potential targets, only to discover that the women had learned to fly in the dark spaces between the beams. They deployed flak batteries in complex patterns, but the Po-2 South were so maneuverable they could thread through defensive fire that would shred larger aircraft. Perhaps most frustrating of all was the night witch's signature attack method. German pilots would finally locate a target, line up for an attack run, and suddenly find themselves pursuing empty air. The Po-2 South would simply cut their engines and disappear into gliding silence, becoming invisible to both sight and sound until they restarted their engines kilometers away after completing their bombing runs. The psychological warfare was equally effective. German pilots, accustomed to the clean technical superiority of modern aerial combat, found themselves defeated by what appeared to be primitive tactics. Radio intercepts revealed growing frustration among Luftwaffe squadrons. How are we supposed to fight an enemy that won't engage in proper combat? These are not pilots, they are magicians or witches. By 1943, the Germans had resorted to offering rewards for shooting down the night witches, a recognition that destroying even one of these primitive aircraft was considered a significant achievement. The Iron Cross was promised to any pilot who could bring down a NACHTHEXEN, an honor typically reserved for much more substantial victories. The irony was profound. The most technologically advanced air force in history was being systematically outmaneuvered by young women flying aircraft that had been obsolete before the war began. The hunters had indeed become the hunted, stalked through the night sky by adversaries who had turned disadvantage into devastating advantage. Between the terror and triumph of their nightly missions, the women of the 588th Regiment created a world that defied every convention of military life. In the brief hours between sorties, when exhaustion should have claimed them completely, they built bonds of sisterhood that would prove stronger than the steel of their aircraft and more enduring than the war itself. Their quarters were often nothing more than dugouts carved from frozen earth or abandoned buildings riddled with shell holes. Yet within these humble spaces, they created sanctuaries of humanity amidst the mechanized horror of modern warfare. Yevgenia Jikolenko would sit cross-legged on her narrow cot, carefully stitching patches onto flight suits by candlelight, her needle working with the same precision she brought to night bombing runs. The women shared everything: their fears, their hopes, their meager rations, and their secrets from home. Letters from mothers, sweethearts, and siblings were read aloud and discussed as community property, each woman living vicariously through the other's connections to the world they had left behind. When word came that someone's family had been evacuated from a besieged city, the entire regiment celebrated. When news arrived of a father killed in action or a home destroyed by bombing, they grieved together. Nadezhda Popova discovered she had a gift for cutting hair, and her tent became an unofficial salon where pilots and navigators would gather before missions to have their locks trimmed and their spirits lifted by gossip and gentle teasing. "If I'm going to die tonight," laughed one navigator, "at least I'll look presentable when I meet my maker." The laughter was often brittle, masking deeper anxieties, but it was genuine nonetheless. Their aircraft became extensions of their personalities in ways that male pilots rarely experienced. The women named their Po-2 South, painted personal insignia on their fuselages, and treated them with a tenderness that bordered on maternal. They would spend precious off-duty hours patching fabric, adjusting control cables, and polishing instruments with a care that went far beyond military necessity. These planes were not just weapons. They were partners, confidants, and often the only thing standing between the women and death. The loss of comrades struck with devastating intensity in such a close-knit community. When Senior Lieutenant Mashay Dolina failed to return from a mission over Novorossiysk, the silence in the regimental quarters was profound. Her bunk remained untouched for 3 days, her personal effects arranged exactly as she had left them, until her best friend finally packed them with tears streaming down her face. Yet somehow, they found ways to celebrate life even in the shadow of constant death. They organized impromptu concerts where pilots with good voices would sing traditional Russian folk songs or popular melodies from before the war. They held birthday parties with whatever they could scrounge, sometimes just black bread and ersatz tea, but served with ceremony and genuine affection. The women also maintained small rituals of femininity that served as anchors to their pre-war identities. They would trade scraps of fabric to make small improvements to their uniforms, share precious tubes of lipstick acquired through black market exchanges, and experiment with hairstyles that would fit beneath their flight helmets. These seemingly trivial acts were actually profound statements of resistance, not just against the enemy, but against the dehumanizing forces of war itself. In quieter moments, they would speculate about their post-war futures with a mixture of hope and uncertainty. Some dreamed of returning to interrupted studies, others of marriages postponed by military service. A few admitted they could no longer imagine life without the intensity and purpose that combat flying provided. "What do you do?" wondered one pilot aloud, "when your job is no longer to be brave every night?" These bonds forged in fire would prove more lasting than the war itself. Decades later, surviving night witches would gather annually to remember their fallen sisters and relive the extraordinary chapter, when ordinary young women had rewritten the rules of aerial warfare through courage, sisterhood, and an unshakable belief in their cause. By 1943, the name NACHTHEXEN had transcended military terminology to become a legend whispered in fearful reverence throughout German ranks. What had begun as harassment raids by untested young women had evolved into a campaign of psychological warfare that struck at the very heart of Nazi military confidence. The night witches were no longer just pilots. They had become symbols of Soviet resistance and living proof that the supposedly superior German war machine could be defeated by courage, ingenuity, and unbreakable will dot the statistics alone, told a story of unprecedented success. The 588th Regiment had flown over 24,000 combat sorties, dropped more than 23,000 tons of bombs, and destroyed hundreds of German aircraft, tanks, supply depots, and command centers. The numbers could not capture the true measure of their impact. They had achieved something that massive tank battles and artillery bombardments could not. They had planted seeds of doubt in German minds about their ability to win the war. Yevgenia Bershanskaya, the regiment's commanding officer, had emerged as a tactical genius whose innovations in night bombing would influence air warfare doctrine for generations. Under her leadership, the Night Witches developed techniques that maximized their aircraft's advantages while minimizing their vulnerabilities. They flew in formations of 3 aircraft, attacking targets in rapid succession to create maximum confusion and prevent effective defensive responses. They varied their approach routes and timing to prevent German forces from establishing predictable defensive patterns. Nadezhda Popova had become perhaps the most famous individual Night Witch, completing over 850 combat missions and earning the Gold Star of Hero of the Soviet Union, the highest decoration the nation could bestow. Her personal tally of destroyed targets read like a military inventory: 18 German aircraft destroyed on the ground, 2 bridges vital to enemy supply lines, 9 enemy encampments, and countless supply convoys reduced to burning wreckage. The psychological profile of their effectiveness was equally impressive. German intelligence reports from 1943 revealed that frontline units requested transfers away from sectors where the Night Witches operated regularly. Sleep deprivation among German troops had become a significant factor in reduced combat effectiveness. Medical officers reported increased instances of what would later be recognized as combat stress reactions, directly attributable to the constant threat of nighttime air attacks. The Luftwaffe's continued failure to neutralize the threat had become a source of professional embarrassment and personal frustration for German pilots. Elite fighter squadrons that had dominated European skies found themselves reduced to ineffective patrols, chasing shadows that vanished before they could engage. The promise of Iron Crosses for shooting down Night Witches had gone largely unredeemed, a testament to the tactical superiority the women had achieved through adaptation and innovation. International recognition began to filter through to the Soviet Union as word of the Night Witches spread beyond military circles. Allied intelligence services studied their tactics with fascination and admiration. British and American aviation experts quietly acknowledged that these young Soviet women had solved tactical problems that had stumped male pilots and military theorists across the globe. The women themselves had evolved far beyond the frightened volunteers who had first climbed into Po-2 cockpits. They moved with the confident precision of master craftsmen, their every action in the cockpit economical and purposeful. They could read weather patterns like poetry, navigate by stars with astronomical accuracy, and deliver ordnance with surgical precision. Fear had not disappeared, but it had been transformed into a tool sharpening their senses, focusing their concentration, and driving them to levels of performance that seemed superhuman. Most remarkably, they had retained their humanity throughout this transformation. They still laughed together, still grieved their losses, still dreamed of post-war futures. They had proven that it was possible to become instruments of war without losing the essential qualities that made them human beings: compassion, loyalty, hope, and an unshakable commitment to protecting what they loved. The Night Witches had become legends while they were still living the story, their reputation spreading through both armies like wildfire. They were no longer just soldiers. They were living symbols of what human beings could accomplish when they refused to accept limitations, when they transformed disadvantage into strength, and when they discovered that the most powerful weapon of all was the courage to keep flying into the darkness. Night after night, mission after mission, until victory was won. As the tide of war began to turn and German forces retreated westward in 1944 and 1945, the Night Witches found themselves facing an unexpected challenge. What happens to warriors when the war ends? For 3 years, their lives had been defined by darkness, danger, and the absolute clarity of purpose that comes from defending one's homeland against existential threat. Now, as victory approached, they confronted a future as uncertain as the night skies they had once ruled. The final missions carried a bittersweet quality that veteran pilots struggled to articulate. Each sortie might be their last, each takeoff potentially the end of the most intense and meaningful chapter of their lives. Nadezhda Popova, completing her 852nd and final combat mission over Berlin in April 1945, described the moment as like saying goodbye to a part of my soul that I would never recover. The armistice brought celebrations across the Soviet Union, but for the Night Witches, the joy was tempered by a profound sense of displacement. Young women who had commanded respect as elite combat pilots suddenly found themselves viewed as temporary curiosities. Their wartime achievements treated as interesting footnotes rather than legitimate military accomplishments. The same society that had desperately needed their courage now seemed embarrassed by evidence of their own women's capacity for violence and leadership. Many of the veterans attempted to return to their pre-war lives, only to discover that both they and the world had changed irrevocably. University classrooms seemed impossibly mundane to women who had once navigated by starlight over enemy territory. Domestic routines felt suffocating to aviators accustomed to the infinite freedom of night skies. Some struggled with what would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress, their sleep haunted by the whisper of aircraft engines and the flash of exploding ordnance. The Soviet government's response to their service was mixed and often disappointing. While some Night Witches received official recognition and awards, many found their contributions minimized or forgotten entirely. The Communist Party seemed uncomfortable with celebrating women whose achievements challenged traditional gender roles, preferring to emphasize their sacrifice rather than their tactical brilliance and leadership capabilities. Yet their story refused to die. Veterans of the Wehrmacht, in their own post-war memoirs and interviews, spoke with grudging admiration of the NACHTHEXEN, who had tormented them through countless sleepless nights. Military historians began to recognize the tactical innovations the women had pioneered, acknowledging that their techniques had influenced the development of modern close air support doctrine